המרצה הבא הוא דוקטור חאלד פוראני. אם כן, דוקטור פוראני הוא פרופסור חבר במחלקה לסוציולוגיה ולאנתרופולוגיה באוניברסיטת תל אביב. תחומי מחקריו כוללים תיאוריה חברתית, מודרניות, שפה וספרות, חילוניות, פלסטינה. אני תרגמתי את זה מאנגלית, אני מקווה שזה יוצא נכון. ותולדות האנתרופולוגיה...
זה בסדר, אנחנו מאשרים.
אתם מאשרים. תולדות האנתרופולוגיה ומאמריו הלא מעטים, אני רואה, הופיעו בכתבי עת כמו American Ethnologist, Comparative Studies in Society and History, Annual Review of Anthropology, Arab Studies, Journal of the American Academy of Religion. הוא פרסם ספר שנקרא Silencing the Sea, Secular Rhythms in Palestinian Poetry in 2012. הוא שוקד עכשיו על ספר נוסף, והרצאתו היא תינתן אגב בשפה, לא אגב, אלא תינתן בשפה האנגלית. ונושא ההרצאה, כפי שתרגמתי אותה לעברית ברשותך, זה הריבונות המודרנית בסימן שאלה, אתגרים פלסטינים מתוך הלוויתן. בבקשה. הוא העדיף לתת את דבריו מכאן, וגם מי שיושב כאן יש לו 25 דקות.
תודה. קודם כל אני מבקש את סליחתכם שאני אדבר באנגלית, הייתי נורא רוצה לדבר בעברית או בערבית איתכם, אבל שפת המחקר שלי היא באנגלית. אם כי הנושא הוא קרוב, אני מניח לכולנו, זה איך לחשוב על ריבונות מקרוב. So, thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be with you thinking on this occasion of relaunching a journal named مجمות, اتجاهات by the way in Arabic, directions, at a time when absence of direction in this country is a prevailing disorientation. It is only befitting then that I start by specifying the directions I am taking and those I'm not. Most broadly speaking, I'm interested in exploring a direction in which sovereignty, الهبنوت, can't be allowed any longer to reign supreme in our political imagination, modern political imagination, and therefore experience. Instead, I'm seeking a direction that ultimately lets it contend with rival conceptions of the political, lest it fully colonize it and our human flourishing along the way. My restrictive purpose here is to attempt a sketch of sample questions that may arrive if we relinquish the commitment to the sovereignty concept itself over our political imagination and dissent from early and leading celebrants, for example, Rousseau, who noted that the principle of political life dwells in the sovereign authority. So to forge dissent from sovereignty as the singular dwelling for the soul, apat nafsho, I think Yuda would say, Yuda Shinhav, my colleague, the soul of modern politics, a return to Hobbes and drilling into his Leviathan becomes inevitable. I want to bring to your attention a quotation from the Quran that has suffused my thinking throughout this paper about questioning modern sovereignty and regimes of sovereignty. It has to do with the Adamic allegory, with the bringing of Adam to the earth. So God is saying to the angels, I am about to found on earth a vicegerent. A vicegerent is a deputy or khalifa, makhlif. They said, will thou place on it such as will spread corruption therein and shed blood, while we do extol thy limitless glory and praise thee and glorify thy holy name. And God said, I know that which you do not know. End of quote. From the second chapter in the Quran, verse 30. What could we possibly ask, and what could we reasonably imagine when sovereignty is dethroned is exactly what I want to begin articulating. As I'm hardly able to reach satisfactory articulations of these questions, it follows that I'm nowhere able to answer them. I may also disappoint those of you who've come here to hear me map or survey research about Palestinians. This is not to say that Palestinians are absent. In fact, it's precisely out of our predicament as Palestinians, bereft of sovereignty, that I believe the question as to the inevitability of sovereignty must be raised. Our experiences murmur to the multiple workings of sovereignty not merely in the names of categories it concocts for them in order to divide and conquer them. Remember that the sovereign alone must remain indivisible, conforming to the molecule that Jean Baudin, planted through the principle of indivisibility into the paradigm of ruling that is sovereignty. I must stress, indivisibility as a principle of sovereignty is precisely the primary and ultimate focus of my presentation today. So what is my argument in a nutshell, in case I lose time, in case for reason or another it doesn't come through all the way. My argument in a nutshell is, in formulating modern sovereignty, the soul of the Leviathan in Hobbes, after fashioning it after a divine paradigm of modern ruling, that is, no sovereignty, no legitimate rule. There lies a dissociable and defining principle within that paradigm known as the Indivisibility Principle. This principle demands the oneness, that is, the self-sufficiency and the autonomy of the sovereign, be it the king, the people later on with Rousseau, or the individual with Kant and Berlin and Mill. In any event, and like the paradigm on the whole, this principle of indivisibility too has retained a logic of divinity. This divinization has unleashed, and here's a crucial point of my argument, has unleashed deleterious consequences for modern ethics. Playing God becomes a paradigm for governance of states and also souls. For in that formulation of sovereignty, injustice towards oneself becomes an impossibility. Denial of the possibility for humans, the denial of that possibility for humans endangers any ethical life oriented towards attunement to the fragility, to finitude, and a proper place for reason in relation to revelation. Ethical life, so endangered, renders sovereignty into regimes of enslavement, masquerading as freedom insofar as they preempt authentic attentiveness to human faculties for living, for dying, and for reasoning necessary for their flourishing. For this reason, a political ethical imagination seeking to avoid being colonized by sovereignty regimes must remain on the alert for contending conceptions of governance, be it of politics, of polities, of persons, that do not impoverish their access, our human access, to the sense of fragility. I may not be directly and explicitly talking about Palestinians, whether in 48 or 67, but I am speaking from a Palestinian standpoint, thus rendering my effort both descriptive and normative. Palestinians have been resisting Israeli encroachment for nearly 150 years to either share the same apple or parts of it. But we have, to my mind, as Palestinians, have little pause to think if this apple is worth having in the first place. When not complicit with the Israeli garden, we Palestinians complain about and resist its enslaving powers, being the sovereignless. But we have not paused enough to think of how Israelis are enslaved by the tyranny of sovereignty and the ways this form of enslavement has already rubbed off on us. In that sense, a primary objective for my talk today is to contribute to an argument on necessity, and that is the necessity of interrogating the condition in which enslavement acquires a form and a norm, so normalized and so ingratiated in the texture of our lives that it ceases to be recognized for what it is. As my aim is to interrogate aspects of the concept of sovereignty, arguably the unthought of modern politics, it appears then profitable to tap into resources from the currently widely discussed field of political theology, a line of inquiry that has been dedicated to the unconsciousness of political imagination and the modern liberal nation state. In political theology, you find resources to take the soul of the polity, so to speak, in this case Israel, not to the court, but to the couch, probing dreams, paranoias, nightmares, denials, and fantasies, and above all, recovering from amnesia. Please beware, it is not simply Israel that interests me, but rather with some tools from political theology, I want to go to 2 flights down, that is to the underthought of the underthought in the Israeli state, by which I mean, again, the nucleus of modern political imagination, and that is sovereignty. It is there that I will go with political theology, but it is also there where I wish to part away from it. I join political theology's interest in expanding the horizon of our understanding of the work of political imagination, but I also assume an adequate expansion of the political experience always reconnects to the ethical. Rather than partake in political theology's own partaking of liberalism's upholding the essentiality of sovereignty, some of which are denied, sovereignty is denied by liberalism in that sense, or its dark aspects are exposed, I instead ask how putting sovereignty as a paradigm of ruling on the couch, we might with Israel as a local embodiment, could enable a glimpse into political horizon in which sovereignty is dethroned as divinity, but not necessarily dismissed. It is there that I think we can rebound the sovereignty concept into ethical questions that have to do with human fragility and human finitude and human reasoning. 3 centuries separate a paradigm and one of its instances. It's been 300 years between a peace that was supposed to end war and a war that was supposed to bring peace. 3 centuries separate between 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, as an inaugurating paradigm and entry into sovereignty regimes, and the 1948 war, out of which a state sovereignty, Israel's sovereignty, was declared, and a homeland, Palestine, was demolished. I suppose, empirically speaking, instances are not as durable as the paradigm from which they emanate. Thinking of the state instances that have come and gone in the world since sovereignty became a regnant paradigm of ruling on the planet, which is not to say that the state has ceased to be a quintessential embodiment of sovereignty. No nearer or clearer example of this coming and going of states exists today than what is happening in the Arab world. And my talk presupposes that Israel is no exception in this regional coming and going. A number of traces are there to observe about the fact of mortality of the state, in which Israel is no exception, state sovereignty, which, by the way, is tantamount to neither Jewish sovereignty nor Jewish nor Israeli presence on the land. Aside from the generic insight of St. Augustine, resuscitated in Hannah Arendt's about political renewal, in which she says what has a beginning must have an end. But there are also other traces, Palestinian poets reminding us of bygone crusader castles as walled-off entities, detached and insulated from the mosaic of civilizations in the region. 2, first, in the very conception of sovereignty, and here we go to Hobbes, one of the appellation the mythical figure has is that he is immortal God. And let me quote Hobbes here. I quote from him directly here for this reason, and for others that will become clearer as I proceed with revisiting the concept of sovereignty. Leviathan notes, the multitude so united in one person is called commonwealth, in Latin civitas. This is the generation of the great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. But there is another way that Hobbes reminds us of the transience of states. And that is when he notes, I put down for one of the most effectual seeds of the death of any state that the conquerors require not only a submission of men's action to them for the future, but also an approbation of all their actions past, when there is scarce a commonwealth in the world whose beginnings can in conscience be justified. And finally, another testimony for transience of states is the word itself in Arabic, dawla. While the Latin state connotes stasis in Arabic, dawla connotes from the verb dala, that which is rotating, changing, and circulating, and wearing out. This is, by the way, one connotation to keep in mind when thinking about, for example, Wa'il Hallaq's recent book, The Impossible State, how the Islamic state, so to distinguish from Islamic governance, is both an impossibility and oxymoronic. It shouldn't be difficult to trace that a molecular and discernible principle in the paradigm of sovereignty is the well-known principle of indivisibility. When the notion of sovereignty in the work of political theology, for example, Schmidt has focused on exception. Writers from within and outside political theology have noticed the dissociability of the principle of indivisibility from the paradigm of sovereignty. What I'm trying to say is that political theology has helped us look at the dark side of, say, liberalism and nation states, violence, exception, the violence within the norm, etc., the constitutional and revolutionary moment. But it has paid little attention, to my surprise, to the sense of the principle of indissociability. And that's where I feel we ought to pay attention, because that's where political imagination could begin to question the whole idea of sovereignty and its dangers for the ethical lives that they enable or discourage. It shouldn't be difficult to trace how indivisibility, like the paradigm of sovereignty itself, too has been modulated to mimic the divine. By 1900, Nietzsche even claimed that the West has killed God. From Boudin's introduction of this principle to Kant's formulation of autonomous individuals as analogues to the divine, from Mill's On Liberty to Berlin's 4 Essays on Liberty, the oneness of the sovereign remain regnant. In other words, if the sovereign is not indivisible, he is not a sovereign. Thus, the sovereignty now charged with crafting states and crafting souls leads to divinization of its bearer, including the individual divinized self. How can we become, I wonder, more properly attentive to our modern state's founding in Protestantism, even if they identify themselves as Islamic or Jewish states? To do so, we ought not to forget Luther and his hold on our modern political imagination when he divinized his conscience in his rebellion against papal authority. Let me quote you Luther, noting that he is utterly free in conscience, innermost being. Or look at the divinization of conscience, the oneness of the individual and the sovereign, when Hobbes writes in his Leviathan, men shall judge what is lawful and unlawful, not by the law itself, but by their own conscience, that is to say, their own private judgment. But let us start with the local. Speaking, political theology here in Israel has been mobilized by writers like Adi Ophir and Yehuda Shenhav in order to question the attainability of the principle of indivisibility, proposing the concept sovereign decisiveness or sovereign gaps, respectively. Yehuda, for example, talks about Chalalei Ribonut. It appears their hope is to transcend the Westphalian conception of sovereignty and formulate a more elastic notion of sovereignty. But besides the elasticity that Ophir and Shenhav are imploring us to introduce into thinking about sovereignty, they are also imploring us to consider, along with Palestinian and Arab writers, what they have been saying about liberal legality and polity even before political theology became at the fore of political inquiry. All these together, they've been encouraging us to look at violence within the rule of law, at the ever-present exception of the norms of law, and the extraordinary within the ordinary. Okay. For example, among Palestinian writers, there is, whether it's all the Zoroics, Constantine, Elia, Raif, from Sayer to Sultani, all of them encourage us to look at the dark spots of liberalism that they can observe. But I think, remarkably, none of them seem to deal with not a dark spot, but a blind spot. And that is the tenacious blind spot, which I call the sovereignty of sovereignty itself over our political imagination. And for that, one has to drill, as Walter Benjamin would say, to drill further into Leviathan and look, for example, at the molecular inquiry level to the principle of indivisibility. Let me tell you what I think could be done with this principle of invisibility if we want to expand our political imagination to open up to ethical questions about the cost and the price of regimes of sovereignty. And what struck me is to hear both Hobbes and echo him later, Rousseau, deny that the human can wrong herself or himself. So let me quote what they say to you. Excuse me. Hobbes, for example, says, in the definition of injustice is no other than the not performance of covenants. This is because earlier Hobbes has already said, if justice and injustice were faculties, they might be in man that were alone in the world, as well as his senses and passions. There are qualities that is, they relate to men in society, not in solitude. When whatsoever he, the sovereign, doth, it can be no injury to any of his subjects, nor ought he to be any of them accused of injustice, because to do injury to oneself is impossible. And Rousseau echoes him later and says, conscience can never deceive us. So my point here, my complaint isn't that the principle of indivisibility controls our understanding of sovereignty and makes it so juridical, so legalistic. My point is that it denies us a crucial possibility for the cultivation of ethical orientations in life. And I mean access to a notion of human fragility, access to a notion of human finitude, and access to the relation between reason and revelation. And I want to suggest, for conclusion, that this could open inquiries into two forms of enslavement that present themselves as freedom. And that is, the state itself usurps our ability to attend authentically, as maybe Heidegger would say, to our own finitude, because again, political theology reminds us how the state, the stronger it is, the more anxious, the more paranoid it becomes about its own existence, ironically. And one wonders if this enigma that Hobbes tells us, the mortal God, is so powerful that it makes us forget our own finitude. One wonders what freedom from death it offers us. The second enslavement takes the form of the tyranny of reason, in the sense that reason becomes, as Kant told us, in a tribunal. It's the altar. And in such a way, it can't ask about the relations between reason and revelation. So the direction I've been proposing to advance beyond considering the existential insecurity of this or that state, and rather to directly confront the insecurity of states governing paradigm of sovereignty, because again, I'm assuming sovereignty was never always just about the political, but it's also an ordering principle, that it's one that opens to politics and ethics. Sovereignty is a Protean principle, and its history is a principle of order. Ordering, for example, the universal and the particular, the subject and the object. This is to say that sovereignty is a principle not only of organizing politics, but also organizing knowledge. Thus, the knowing sovereign person constitutes the autonomous reasoning person, and the autonomous reasoning person is also the bearer of reason as a sovereign charged with drawing all the distinctions. I'm suggesting that impoverishing an attunement to human fragility will also blind us to the fragility of our reason, make us gullible to the fiction of reason as sovereign, absolute, and supreme over our acts and words, indeed over revelation. And we must remember that reason must invariably fail as the ultimate marker of all distinctions. However, recognizing reason's fragility requires an ethics in which humans are not exactly autonomous, and there is doubtless no greater effrontery to Kant than relinquishing one's autonomy. What this alliance between sovereignty of reason and political sovereignty has done is to separate reason from revelation. This is why Paul Kahn, indicates in his reading of Schmitt that a theological reading of sovereignty will bring under scrutiny cardinal separations in the modern age, beyond friend and enemy, beyond public and private, beyond external and domestic, but also epistemologically, the concept of sovereignty should open to our modern separation between reason and revelation. Therefore, it becomes paramount for questioning sovereignty to interrogate not only claims the state makes to owning reason, but also to the tyrannical claims of reason itself as a sovereign. I'm referring here, as I said, to the sacred altar in liberalism of the tribunal of reason. In what ways this tyranny of reason is a form of enslavement is yet another form that the questioning of sovereignty could take. It's but one of the ironies, of course, that in the land in which the revelatory mode of knowledge has been most at home via Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, it comes a Jewish state to participate in revelation's Western demotion and alienation from the world. In conclusion, a questioning of sovereignty appears linked to questions about the kinds of human ends, the telos, that deserve our allegiance. In the course of this questioning, notions of human ends or human telos appear from beyond their concealment as other than those equated with the victorious sovereign. One such telos offered in the Muslim tradition is that of the vicegerent or deputy or khalifa before and beyond its perverse appropriation by warlords and invalidations for secular prejudice. Could the conception of the human as deputy rather than equivalent of the divine, the human with adequate attention to fragility and finitude, as a vicegerent, for example, Khalifa, could that concept offer a viable contender for the sovereignty regime consecrated to sovereignty worship? In what ways does the Ottoman experience or the Tunisian experiment offer polities and persons what I call humility resources to enable a search for decolonized, wise, and durable governance over polities and persons? Thank you.